Your pulse is 242. Your blood pressure is practically non-existent. Assuming you call that green stuff in your veins blood.
The readings are perfectly normal for me, Doctor, thank you. And as for my anatomy being different from yours, I am delighted.
Why do Vulcans have green blood? The short answer is that Vulcan blood is copper-based. But what does that actually mean, and does it make any scientific sense at all? Today we're going to explore the fascinating biochemistry of blood color, examine what Star Trek tells us about Vulcan blood, and then dive into some real-world examples to see if green blood is purely science fiction or if there's more truth to it than you might think. Blood color actually varies quite a lot between different species in Star Trek. Ferengi have yellow blood, Bolians and Andorians have blue blood, and several species are green-blooded, including Vulcans, Orions, Romulans, and Remans. Most humanoid species, however, including humans, have red blood, so it makes sense to start there. Why is human blood red in the first place? Human blood is red because of a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is incredibly specialized for one job, carrying oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body. And here's how it works. Hemoglobin is a very large protein that contains 4 smaller groups called heme groups, and at the center of each heme group there's an iron atom. It's this iron that binds to oxygen and does the job of carrying oxygen around the body. It is also the iron in hemoglobin that's responsible for the red color of blood. Because of iron, hemoglobin scatters red light, and the way the protein interacts with light actually changes depending on whether or not the blood is oxygenated, when it becomes bright red, or deoxygenated when it becomes darker, sort of a purplish red color. But why do our cells need iron to carry oxygen in the first place? Well, that's because the amino acid chains that make up most proteins are not good at binding oxygen in a reversible manner, so they need to exploit the properties of a metal that has a strong affinity for oxygen, such as iron. Iron can bind to oxygen in a way that is strong enough that it can carry oxygen through blood to different body parts, but weak enough that it can release the oxygen when it reaches its destination. And critically, iron is not the only metal that can do this job. An alternative to iron is copper. Copper is another transition metal that has similar properties. It also can bind reversibly to oxygen, and critically, it interacts with light in a different way. So it is feasible that if hemoglobin was copper-based instead of iron-based, blood would have a different color. And in Star Trek, this is specifically the reason why Vulcan blood is green. This is specifically stated in the episode Obsession in the original series. The episode begins with Kirk and Spock inspecting a source of tritanium, a material 21.4 times as hard as diamond, not to mention one of the resources in Star Trek Catan. When they're about to beam out, Captain Kirk senses a sweet odor like honey and immediately sends a team of security officers on a swing around the perimeter. He tells them to scan for dicuronium in the atmosphere and fire phasers at the first sight of any gaseous cloud. Kirk isn't sure there's a problem yet. The last time he encountered this phenomenon was 11 years earlier, but when the cloud appears, it kills 2 of his crewmen, leaving no red cells in their bodies. Years earlier, when he was serving on the Farragut, Kirk encountered this strange vampiric creature for the first time. A gaseous cloud that feeds on the blood of humanoids and disappears without a trace. It left a trail of 200 bodies on the Farragut, and now Kirk is determined to catch the creature once and for all. The episode unfolds as a Moby Dick type of story, populated with a space vampire and a chief medical officer who's considering ruling the captain unfit for duty, all of which are themes which recur on Star Trek several times. The tension reaches its peak when the creature invades the Enterprise and engulfs Mr. Spock, but Spock leaves, and the reason, as it turns out, has a lot to do with the copper in his blood.
It's that green blood of his.
My hemoglobin is based on copper, not iron.
I'll bet he left a bad taste in the creature's mouth, too.
Colloquially expressed, but essentially correct.
Vulcans have hemoglobin just like humans, but their hemoglobin uses copper instead of iron as the central metal atom. This substitution is what gives the blood its distinctive green color. Now we have to remember that we're talking about Spock here, and Spock is a half human, half Vulcan, so his physiology is a bit different. In fact, later on in this episode, he does say that his blood has very little hemoglobin, which is a bit confusing. And what I think he means is that he probably has some iron-based hemoglobin on account of having human genes from his mother, but he has very little of it, which is why he wasn't affected by the creature. So this is how I'm interpreting what he says here, but it's not 100% set in stone. But never mind that for a moment. Let's say we accept the explanation that Vulcan blood is green because it has copper in its hemoglobin. This is where things get interesting and a little bit complicated, because there are creatures on Earth that have copper-based blood chemistry, but their blood isn't green at all. It's blue. On Earth, there are some invertebrates that have copper-based blood chemistry. Specifically, some mollusks and arthropods have a respiratory protein called hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin. Hemocyanin serves the same basic function as hemoglobin. It carries oxygen through the bloodstream. Now, strictly speaking, these invertebrates don't have blood. We call their circulatory fluid hemolymph, but I'm calling it blood here for simplicity reasons. Still, hemocyanin has a few key differences in relation to hemoglobin. First of all, it's a copper-based respiratory protein, so it has copper instead of iron as the atom that reversibly binds to oxygen. Secondly, hemoglobin sits inside red blood cells. Hemocyanin floats freely in the circulatory fluid, but it does interact with light differently than hemoglobin does, and when hemocyanin binds to oxygen, it turns the circulatory fluid blue. So, does that mean that Vulcans should have blue blood instead of green? Well, not necessarily. Remember that Spock said that he has copper-based hemoglobin. So right there, we know that he has a respiratory protein that sits inside his cells, unlike hemocyanin. So we could speculate that the combination of a copper-based respiratory protein that sits inside the cells with other cellular elements and perhaps cellular fragments in Vulcan blood is what gives blood its distinctive green color. And even if you're skeptical about this explanation, I'd have to point out that there are circumstances on Earth when human blood actually can turn green. There's a condition called sulfhemoglobinemia, where sulfur atoms bind to the hemoglobin molecule, giving blood a distinctive green color. This is very rare. I have never seen it in clinical practice, but when it occurs, it happens because of sulfur-containing medications, or sometimes because of occupational exposure to sulfur-containing chemicals. There's also an episode of House MD in season 4, where they're investigating a patient with spinal muscular atrophy, and then they draw blood for, I don't remember what exam they were I think they were testing him for strongyloids, and when they draw blood, the blood comes out green.
Is he a Vulcan? If no, what makes Nimoy bleed green?
Now, in that circumstance, what happened is that they had injected the patient with a contrast, but the patient had kidney failure, so the kidneys couldn't clear the contrast out, and the green we were seeing was actually the color of the contrast. That's how they diagnosed kidney failure in that case. This type of contrast-induced change in blood color is unusual, but not unheard of. When I was doing research for this video, I came across a few fascinating case reports. The first one was a short article called A Case of Green Blood, describing an 86-year-old woman who underwent surgery for endometrial adenocarcinoma, which is a type of uterine cancer. During some of the routine blood work for that surgery, the team that drew the blood saw that it appeared green. In that particular case, they hypothesized that the color was caused by the contrast that had been administered for the surgery. Another short report, this one titled Bright Green Serum, talked about a 49-year-old woman with contrast-induced kidney failure. After undergoing an angiography, which is a procedure where they inject contrast to make your blood vessels visible on X-ray, her blood remained green for 4 days afterwards. So we have established that Star Trek's explanation for green blood draws on some real-world biochemistry, and that it is possible for humans to have green blood under specific conditions. But let's ask a deeper question. Is it possible that a humanoid could evolve to have copper-based hemoglobin? Well, it's a complicated question to answer, but if we're speculating about it, it is possible, yes. But it would depend on very specific conditions. So probably one of the reasons why our hemoglobin uses iron, in addition to iron's strong affinity for oxygen, is just that iron is incredibly common on Earth. So perhaps we can hypothesize that in a different planet, where copper was more abundant than iron, then perhaps evolution would favor copper-based respiratory molecule. It would really depend on what kinds of advantages a copper respiratory molecule would offer in comparison to iron. And then we can think about some of the things we know about Vulcan from Star Trek lore. So we know that Vulcan is hot, that it's arid, that it has a thinner atmosphere than Earth. Perhaps in those conditions, copper is actually a more advantageous molecule, right? There is a Star Trek role-playing game manual that says that copper is more efficient at utilizing the lower amounts of oxygen available in the Vulcan atmosphere. So that's one way to go about it. And of course, sometimes the reason why different species have different colored blood in Star Trek has nothing to do with anything that we talked about, right? So Memory Alpha says that it was actually a director in the original series, Mark Daniels, who came up with the idea of Vulcans having green blood. And he thought of that because of the tone of the complexion of Vulcan characters. He thought that if they were making their skin look that color with makeup, it would make sense that they would have green blood underneath. And it was an idea that Gene Roddenberry rejected at first, but eventually stuck. Much in the same way that we know in Star Trek Klingons have iron-based blood like us, and that their blood is red. But in the Undiscovered Country, we saw Klingon blood as pink. And the reason for that was because having red blood floating all over the ship would make the movie too violent for the time. So I know that there's this kinds of backstage explanations, but I just think it's more interesting. When I'm watching these stories, I exist inside these universes. I think the immersion aspect is one of the best parts of science fiction and fantasy, so I think it's particularly fun to dive into the in-universe explanations for why this could be the case. And if you think about it, the idea that you can change a single atom inside a respiratory molecule and that would be responsible for changing blood color, it's a very elegant word-building solution that does make scientific sense. And you can reuse that to explain the blood color of different species, right? So I know that it's not in canon sources, but in non-canon sources, it has been speculated that some species that have orange blood have it because the metal in the center of their respiratory molecules is platinum or mercury. So you can do a lot of things with that. You can play around with that. There's more things we could say about blood in Star Trek, even about Vulcan blood. So we could talk about blood types, for instance, because in Journey to Babel, we learn that Spock and his father have T-type blood, but Spock, because of his hybrid nature, has T-type blood with human factors. So eventually you can talk about what that means and talk about human blood types. And the fact, most people think that humans have only 4 types of bloods, A, B, and O, but there's actually some rarer blood types, and it would be fun to talk about that in the context of Vulcan T-type blood. But for now, I think we'll stop here. If, however, you want more, and you like these kinds of medical deep dives into Star Trek themes, then I would suggest you watch my most recent video, which is about unethical medical experiments conducted on humans in Star Trek, looking at episodes from the original series all the way to Voyager. I'm still working on my video about cloning on Star Trek, which I'm hoping will be the next one I publish after this. But for now, this is it. It's been very nice being here. I really enjoyed writing this. Thank you for watching, and until we meet again, live long and prosper.
Please, just tell me what's on your mind.